This is the beautiful thing about looking at something in retrospect, literally to something that was made 20 years ago. Metroid Prime Remastered for the modern generation. Now, I call these videos concept art roasts, but technically all it really is me digging into the insights of game development, looking at it from the perspective of a concept artist. I myself have shipped many games, so I have some insight into how concept art is used in video games, because I've shipped a few of these things. And so what these videos are is really if you're an aspiring concept artist or an aspiring game developer, or you just really want to know how games are made, a little bit more about that. That's what I'm here to talk about. That's what we're going to dig into, specifically for Metroid Prime. Hell of a game. Mixes all the best of great old school game design with modern graphics and modern controls. Because if you know, old controls on those old games were really difficult. But whatever the case, there's a ton of artwork. The way that they've released it in the game is that if you collect all the items throughout the game, this is nice, just like a nice little perk. But what's neat is they also included the original concept art. So we're going to be taking a look at how those pieces might have influenced the design of the game, the look of the game throughout the development. Let's start with this one right here. So Android Jones specifically had this fascination with like x-rays, and specifically he was like going and like cutting into corpses and things like that. This guy was like one of those artists that's more of an artiste. I don't think he likes video games at all. And in fact, in many interviews, he says that he doesn't. And he has some harsh words about him. But he was a hell of an artist and a tremendous world builder, and had a great sense of color and form and lighting, and shape sifting is kind of his thing. And this was right at the era when he was starting to dig into a lot of that. You see that influencing the game's development. Now, how useful is something like this, for instance, in game development? Even back then, I would say pretty nominally. Now, however, in 2002, 2003, there were no art schools teaching what concept art for video games is. In fact, some concept artists would just get hired because they would inspire the team. So there was basically a blank page back then, and nobody knew how this could look. I mean, this was Metroid being developed by a US game development studio. It was a totally different take on what Metroid had been up to that point. The most previous game, I think, was Zero Mission, or the Game Boy Advance games. This was the first time it was really being adapted into like something bigger. And the only reason that happened is because, for instance, they would never let a US studio develop a Zelda game. That was unheard of, but Metroid wasn't a big seller for them, so they allowed the US studio at Retro Studios, which they had just acquired, to make this game. And so it was kind of like a unique American take on, science fiction fantasy, which is a really interesting universe. The universe of Metroid is very unique to itself. And a lot of these things got defined during this period of time. So images like this, you might find them somewhere in, let's say, like the scanner. Like, I think that some of these concepts may have sparked that interest and design thought around this idea of going through the world and scanning enemies, scanning their biology, scanning their internal makeup. And it's possible that without the contribution of the concept art that was obsessed with anatomy and anatomical structures and these X-ray type of approaches, we might not have ever even gotten that. Now, I don't know that for certain. It may have been that the designers were like, oh, hey, we really want to explore this X-ray stuff, and this artist happens to be fascinated with that, so let's hire him onto the project. But whatever the case, it doesn't really help for building a model, but it might be great for things like consoles that you might look at, or inspiring the shape of the look of some of the monitors and displays. Now, this one is, you'll see that the ones from the modern version are marked as remastered, and you'll notice an immediate jump in just the way that concept art has been refined to where now we're looking at very specific, almost like realistically rendered pieces, such as these crates. Now, if you ever wanted to work in video games, doing designs like crates and boxes and architectural hits of detail, such as like what you see here, this crystal thing, these save stations, like these are the kind of thing that are immensely, like, so hireable. Like, there's so many jobs for people to just design constructions of functional mechanics that it's in many ways, it's just one of the most underappreciated and one of the most highly desired roles, or not desired by artists, desired by employers. They're desperately seeking people to do exactly this kind of design work for games. And there's a lot of science to it, such as the construction. You have to think about like the materials that are available in the environment, and what does that say about the people that built this thing? Like, what would they keep inside of there? Is this a highly valued treasure spot, or is this something that, you know, is like kind of a ramshackle kind of nuts and bolts kind of construction, or is it super slick and sci-fi and modernized, you know, or futuristic? You know, and so like those are the kind of things. There's a lot more to it than that, because there's also like considering shape language and what the shapes are implying when you're looking at the details of things. You know, is there an energy source that's actually like emanating power off of this? And if so, like, do we need the player to really notice this in this environment? Does it need an interior light of some kind, something that glows and lights up and really communicates to the player that this is something that is you need to interact with? You know, that psychology is not something that's just, you know, flippantly thrown into the game. It's like there's conscious decisions being made about like colors, materials, construction, shape language, everything down to like the chunks of rust that are in here that implies that this is sort of an abandoned station of some kind, some abandoned and old and dilapidated by the environment that it's in. Maybe there's harsh weather conditions. This is another one from the remastered. And so like what you'll see here is very likely a paint over of the original. And so it's got this nice atmosphere, and certainly like, you know, having things like depth and having the sense that there's like smoke and fog and like little bits of particles in the air is a lot more of something that you could do in modern consoles, but it's not necessarily something that you could have done back in the old GameCube days. In fact, I challenge you to find any game that has a lot of atmospheric density, such as like volumetric fog or things like that. And if it does, they really had to fake the technology, because it's not something that was easily available. And in fact, if you did concept art that had a lot of particles in the air and atmosphere in the air, then a lot of times you'd get the final model and it just wouldn't have any of that. It'd be stripped clean of it, because it wasn't something that was like, you know, like how it is today. It's just built into Unreal Engine, and almost any game console that's modern will allow for particles in the air like this. You know, it's just a matter of what can you envision. But there are some consistent things that are going on here that are really interesting, because one of the cool things about Metroid is that each zone kind of has its own biome. And so like you have your lava biome, you have your snow and icy biome. And there's a kind of consistency of mood and temperature and colors that are used, you know, in these environments, as well as the history, the implied history of the Chozo. So the Chozo were this ancient race of aliens. And so you have a lot of their architecture and hits of their architecture and shapes that are consistent with their styling in here. And this actually really affected me when I was working on a lot of the Draenei architecture for World of Warcraft, is that I was looking a lot at the Chozo, because they had this astrological kind of implications in their architecture and in their designs. You don't see much of it in this shot, but you see it elsewhere in the game. So jumping fast forward to the modern approach, when we're looking at environments, I would say that a lot of these, and I've said this before because I've also talked about concept art from the Resident Evil series, it's really exciting to remaster or remake something that already existed, because you've got this groundwork. And this is in the lower magma caves, and I was telling you about earlier about the biomes, the different biomes. In this area, you wouldn't have any of those cool blues or things like that. I am a little bit surprised that we don't have things like, for instance, you know, some kind of a crystal or something, but maybe that draws too much attention to itself. One of the things that you'll notice is we were already looking at some concept art earlier in this video of a close-up and a breakdown of this mechanical device up here. And what that is a grappling point in the game. And they needed it to look like it stands out as a very clear interactive object. And so that becomes very key when you're doing concept art, is that you need to have like call-outs of specific mechanical devices that you might have in your environment. This is also from the remastered version, but this is another evidence of what I was talking about before, where you're seeing those mechanical breakdowns. Like we have this kind of like mechanism in the wall, and I would suspect that there's a little bit of 3D actually underneath and behind this. If we were to look at the development of it, I almost guarantee that these objects were painted over the original screenshots. As you can see, there's a lot of detail in here, and it's subtle. And we also see things like the rust that's going on up here, and they do go into like adding a little bit of shadow in their sketches, because that really informs and clearly communicates what we're looking at. The rendering and the materials and the lighting, all those things are really, think of it like vocabulary. It's like, yeah, sure, you can communicate your ideas to somebody in a foreign language, but the more you can articulate, the clearer your language is, your rendering skill, lighting, understanding, and fundamentals, the more clearly you can communicate your ideas. And that's really what concept art is, and what we're really doing. And so if you're watching this, you may begin to understand why I'm so adamant about the how things like AI, for instance, are really just a tool, because so much of this has to be designed with intention. The designer is thinking about the height of the player, the way that the player can interact with these objects, and what it communicates subtly on a subconscious level to the player. It's not as random as people think. And I get why people don't really understand that, because from the outside looking in, concept art just looks random. It looks like, oh, pretty pictures. But when you really dig into it, there's a lot of structure behind it. And there's a lot of fundamental storytelling that's really behind good concept art. And there's game design behind good concept art. This is another example of where you'll see how they've taken a screenshot. It's very clear that there was a screenshot. You can still see the old GameCube version of the model of this Chozo throne right here. And I remember this room specifically because you have to keep going back to it. But they've just drawn over to add more details, but you can still see that what they did was really just this sketch. And sometimes when you're doing concept art, you just need to communicate how something might have broken apart, or how a door slides open. So you might have, arrows like pointing, in just like a direction to show, well, this piece slides over here and out of the way. And if you're working with a manager or an art director that doesn't understand the value of just sketching ideas out, then you probably want to consider leaving that team as quickly as possible, or finding a different project to work on, because this kind of a thing is essential for game development. It's just part of the process. And in many ways, this is what the art director could or should be doing if the team is small enough. But once you get into like these big teams, art directors generally don't have much more time than to just sit down and give overarching direction to their leads. They usually don't sit down and work with concept artists directly anymore if a team is really big. But if a team is like under 30 people or under 50 people, then yeah, I do think that an art director should be going in and like doing these kind of sketches over the top of things, and then maybe handing it to another artist to like work out the texture and then pass that along to the 3D modeler. And that would be an effective team dynamic. We have more from the remastered edition here, and things like this, again, it's a paint over. We can see that they've got the Samus in a T-pose here, but it's really just a paint over of the environment that we remember from the original. Like, this was an actual corner in the GameCube version, and what they've done is they've gone, well, we can have so much more geometry now, and we can have so much more like plant life growing up these things. And without this concept art, I don't know that a developer would want to add these things.
I mean, in essence, most of my job while I was working in concept art at these studios, most of my job was exactly this: taking something that was either a blank page or something that was like roughly sketched out, and then you kind of pick up the ball and you carry it for like a couple of yards. You find a couple of solutions that another artist, a 3D artist on the team or another concept artist on the team, can vibe off of, or even the designer. A lot of times, as a concept artist, you're kind of creating design things. Like, a designer might look at this paint over and go like, oh, well, maybe what we could do then, because we have these vines kind of coming in here, maybe what we could do is actually use that to affect the flow, the direction that we want the player to look, because this is something else that people don't really account for when they're thinking about what concept art is. They don't account for the fact that when the artist is designing something, they are creating the decisions about like where the light is going, where the viewer is going to want to look. And that can be color cues, it can be flow, it can be composition. These are things that like an outside contractor, for instance, might not have the understanding of, or, if you're just using any kind of automated procedures, they might not have the understanding of the psychology of what we want the player to think at this moment in time about the history of the place, about the lore, the flow of where we want the player to go, about gameplay functions, maybe like something that would imply there's a space or a doorway or a space for the player to pass through amongst all this rubble and debris, something that's more structured versus something that's more chaotic, for example. That's the kind of thinking that you have to really wrap your head around when you've been doing this in an office with a group of developers, not just artists, but like developers, designers, programmers, producers, people who have very structured minds as well, people who are very focused on just the gameplay experience, not just the beautiful art that is your job to create. You have to consider a lot of and appreciate their contribution and their understanding, their perspective, because oftentimes it really determines what it is that you're there to do. So like stuff like this, I'm really appreciative that Nintendo and Retro Studios decided to put this stuff in here. I know I called this video the roast and I'm mostly just complimentary, but like to me, it's a testament to just efficient game development. And some might argue that, hey, Retro Studios, they're not exactly like putting out a new game every year, the way that, some other studios just jam them out. But what we get is something that's very crafted, and that's something that particularly as an indie game developer with Aquatic Moon, with the Twilight Monk game, it's like we want for everything to feel crafted. So yeah, we're doing the same kind of a thing where we're taking screenshots and we're like, well, we need a point of interest here. We need something that communicates this aspect of the story. And I've written several novels, so it's like we're infusing the lore into the visual presentation of the game. And that's where you're getting these things like this. Like, in fact, this is, if you're familiar with the game, there was a space station, and I believe this is like parts of that crashed space station that we started at the very beginning of the game that we saw. And so like seeing how it's been crashed. And I wish that it was a higher resolution, but you can really see the details when I zoom in here. If you take a look at this, it's not like it's all about the fidelity of the rendering on this, right? Right? Then this is from the remastered, right? This is new. This is the recent stuff. This isn't like, oh, that's how they did it 20 years ago. Like, no, this is how they're still doing it today. And that will continue to be the case. And that's also something that I hope that more developers will pay that kind of attention to. I think the successful developers will. The people who are making the very crafted worlds. Again, just so much of this cool, like, mechanical design. Shots like this, you might be thinking, well, that's what I want to be doing. Yeah. Let somebody else handle all that, like coming up with ideas. I'll just beautify it. And then I get to, put my name on a beautiful painting because that's what the general public is going to really appreciate. And technically speaking, pieces like this are really just flexing. All that is it's sort of like, it's like the bodybuilding competitions. It's like, are they really strong or is it really just about like greasing up them muscles for a magazine cover photo shoot? You know what I mean? Or it's like a filter on your iPhone, like Instagram. It's like, it's flexing. It's showing off what you're capable of. It's showing off the beauty and the prestige, but it's not necessarily as functional as some of those other things. Now, early in development, something like this can be huge, especially, and I could totally see this pitch meeting where they're like, we could just up-res what we have and call it the Metroid remastered or whatever. But like, we don't have to like go in and redo art or anything. But dudes, check out this concept that, we had the team cook up, and maybe it's, the art director. I could just totally see this pitch meeting where they're like, we could just, re-release what we have, low poly, but it's, it's the original, just up-resed with better controls. But look at what we could do. And if I were Nintendo and I saw this, super rendered version compared to the original, and I wish that you could see the original right next to this, like, what's underneath it, because this is clearly a paint over of a shot from the original GameCube version. But I could totally see executives at Nintendo going, well, hell yeah, with new tech, we want that. And how long will it take? Oh, a couple of years or a year? Okay. Like, this is a team that worked on the original, although technically speaking, to be fair, not many people in the game industry stay at a studio for 20 years. That's like kind of rare. And I knew some people who worked on the original Metroid Prime trilogy that are just not there anymore. But, you know, they're still tied to it. They're still friends with people that work there, obviously. But like the number of people, when I interviewed at Retro Studios, the number of people that worked in the whole studio was under 50 people. And that was after Metroid Prime 3, I believe. And I could be wrong about those numbers, but it was small. It was a small building. It was a small studio. And I really wanted to work on like Metroid Prime 4 or something. Like that would have been my jam, which I've had pre-ordered for 5 years, by the way. I still on Amazon. I'm not canceling that pre-order. If it ever happens, I'm looking forward to it. These pieces are beautiful. They are absolutely wonderful. It's rare that you get a chance as a concept artist to do something that's kind of blue sky and highly detailed like this. To give you an idea, you'd probably get about, if it's early in development and things aren't really scheduled, or the studio sort of like in flux and waiting for sort of green lights on what project is next, etc. If you're a concept artist on that team, you might have yourself, you know, a week or two to do maybe 2 or 3 pieces like this. And that's about it. You know, I mean, these days it might even be more hardcore schedule. They might say, well, we need pieces like this every 2 days. And that's not unreasonable, especially because it is a paint over. What does matter is like atmosphere, mood, you know, colors, the temperature, the vibe of it. You know, like is this creating a vibe that we want to aim for? And that's kind of the blue sky. But then everything goes to, you know, something more detailed. This is another example of one of those like highly detailed, super like, you know, painted over, high concept. You know, this is what the rooms could look like with more, you know, realistic lighting, some volumetric fog going on, you know, some more particle effects, like modernized kind of a take. They wouldn't do stuff like this on the original back in 2000. That's not usually in 2003 or whatever it was, 2000 roughly. You wouldn't have had a team of concept artists. You would have had like one guy because they're the best artist or the best 2D artist. They just draw a lot more than everybody else. Like one dedicated concept artist on a team of 40, 50 people. Okay. These days, you generally have a lot more, you know, because they tend to just throw a lot more ideas at the table. But what you're usually doing, this is the original stuff, by the way. And it's really, oh man, it's so hard to see what we're actually looking at. But these are basically like noodly breakdowns of some of the Chozo ruins, and just like, here's like a little scaffolding. And again, you know, this might have been like the 3D modeler on the team doodling these things out. This might have been the art director himself. This might have been, you know, somebody else on the team doodling these ideas out in sketch form. This is really what raw concept art is. And that person, or the art director anyway, may very well look at something and go, you know what, we really like this idea. And these are great talking points in meetings, by the way, when they're like trying to figure out, what do we do with all the different zones? And they got the map up and they're like, well, we want to get like maybe, you know, more rendering going on this wall here. And like, what's in those chambers within the wall? And like, you know, maybe pieces like this, sketches like this are what sort of feed the task list of what the concept artists will be working on next. And oftentimes you find yourself, if you're one of these guys, generally like that's more of like the designer, director, or you know, what they might be doing. But I've often found that as the concept artist, you're doing a lot of this stuff that then the designers look at and they go, oh, wow, that is a cool idea. Let's work that into the location. And then they go to their maps and then they're like, you know, well, let's use this in this part of the map, and let's use this other design over here in this other area. And then they pass that on to other artists to do more detailed renderings. But even then, those detailed renderings aren't much more detailed than this. And this is from the original 2003 development. And this is more of what like concept art, if you were lucky, you'd get to like spend a lot of time on a piece like this. And this is, you know, when you compare it directly to some of the more modern pieces, it's like, well, you know, it's not as detailed or intricate or like refined, let's say, but there's a lot of really neat like ideas that shaped the look of things here. And especially when you look at like, you know, the dark, cloudy skies, even in GameCube era, this was like new. if you think about it, like the first time we really got like a dark, moody kind of a game was probably in the and some people are going to correct me on this, but like we didn't really have a lot of atmosphere and mood in games back then. And if a game did come along that had that, it was like it really stood out. Metroid Prime was one of those games that artistically really stood out in 2003 across the landscape of most of the games that were out there, right? And I think it was 2003, 2004, roughly, if I'm not mistaken. But pieces like this, again, kind of rare that an artist would get a chance to do something like this. And I happen to know that back then, it was not uncommon for artists to just be hanging out at the studio till late at night, just putting in that extra mile. But shots like this is the equivalent of those highly rendered kind of establishing shots, even though the player would never really see it at this angle. It's not something that's an in-game shot. And if you are going to do those kind of establishing high level, high concept pieces, usually you got to do it from the game camera. For example, everything on Diablo 3, we had to do like every location was designed from the camera's perspective, or top down. Because what's the point of designing something that you're looking up, if the player never really even gets to look up? But a piece like this, if it's early enough in development, it's like, well, what does that location even look like? This is a shrine, okay? So this particular location, they needed to have some kind of high level concept. Usually back then, it wasn't even easy to like just grab a screenshot the way it is now. Like, quite honestly, man, you guys have no idea. It was like we were banging sticks together and shit to just try to get a little bit of a spark. It was like you wanted to capture like a screenshot. There was no YouTube back then. You couldn't just like, I remember having, if I wanted to like watch playthroughs of video games, there was a specialized website that was considered piracy. It was illegal back then to like just download the gameplay of somebody's playing a game. This was before, what was it? Jason TV, which turned into Twitch or whatever it's called. Like, yeah, man, Justin TV. Yeah. Before it turned into Twitch, it was called Justin TV. And that was like considered fringe. There was like worries about copyright of your projects, of your games and stuff back then. But anyway, that's maybe a different topic. Times change, This is more of establishing shots, and these kind of shots I talk about. If you're in my art YouTube or Discord, if you're in my Discord, which you can follow a link in the YouTube video below in the description. If you're in my Discord, you'll know that every month we do art challenges, and these are concept art challenges, and oftentimes I'll ask the group to do shots like this. These are basically cutaways is what they call them. And it's sort of like the intention is obviously to like show, well, this is how a corridor connects to, another more mechanical corridor. And this does kind of show you a little bit of what we're looking at here, which is like these things, we see these everywhere in the final game, which are the map indicators of transitioning to a new location. And maybe this was early in development where they didn't know how they were going to use that. But this symbol like represents connecting rooms to a map, really unique in a weird kind of a circular shape. Like it takes a certain level of being a little bit out of your mind, but also very attuned to the subconscious nature of human thinking to even conceptualize something like a new map display that you might see in a science fiction hologram, and those are the kind of things that you need to think about and wonder about when you're analyzing a video game, or when you're trying to design something for a video game, thinking in terms of the logic of the people who live in that world, whether it's science fiction or whether it's fantasy. Think about their limitations of their world and the way that they would begin to think. So if you've got a totally different kind of an alien race, like how would they think about the construction of their buildings? They might think of things totally differently. Maybe their energy is like powered by something that we're not familiar with, we don't have in our world. But then you get to something like this and it's like, oh, well, shit, yeah, that stands out. You know why? Because it's from the remastered edition, and hopefully we can pull up the original. But these are basically just working over the existing models. I'm a little bit surprised at that it's not more highly rendered, and because but certainly all the information you need to be able to build the model is here. And this is something else that a lot of concept artists don't consider, is that oftentimes if you have a really interesting character like this that has unique design elements, well, what's that look like from the back? Like, as a concept artist, oftentimes you got to figure that out. Yeah, and you got to explain it. And like when you're in a meeting and they're like, well, what's up with his metal butt cheeks? You got to be like, wow, because he's got to sit on like a metal chair. And it's really painful if he doesn't have metal butt cheeks. Sometimes you got to explain, you got to explain stuff like that. And ideally, your monsters are usually, when you're designing them, it really is more about the function than it is about anything else. Really, like a lot of times, what you get is a designer will come to you and they'll be like, "Well, this is a monster that has like weak points in the shoulders because it's like the arms are being held on by this like power suit thing." And usually, designers are thinking in terms of how the player is using the existing arsenal or abilities that they have, and it's the concept artist's job to sort of transpose that visually, the function of it. So a designer might simply say, oh, this is a character that has these large claws and he does these kind of sweeping motions and attacks, and the player has to hit their vulnerable bits on the back. You see what I'm saying? Like, that's the thinking you have to have as a concept artist. Those are the kind of problem solving challenges, because and I emphasize that the concept artist is always dealing with the problem solving of transposing what design wants gameplay to be to the visual. You are a mediator between those two. You can't just outsource that. I thought this was really interesting because we get to see the space pirates, the way that they were sketched back in 2002, 2003 era. I may be off with the dates, but it's roughly 20 years ago. And this is again, Corel Painter. You can definitely see the kind of stylization, the kind of like working from silhouettes. And it's one thing that I know about this particular artist is that the way that he tended to work back then anyway, it's not like this anymore, but the way he worked back then was that he would start out with these just shapes, and then he would go in and add in like highlights to sort of carve or pull out the shape, the final look and style and design of his shapes. This is the beautiful thing about looking at something in retrospect, literally to something that was made 20 years ago, like how concept art has changed fundamentally. And this is also very apparent right here. And I think that there's some space pirates that were done in the modern remastered gallery, right? Just to see it so blatantly, directly contrasted. And these were these might have been the final space pirate designs. And I think what's really neat here is you can definitely see that kind of approach of working from the silhouette and then like kind of pulling out the details and the design of things, the lighting, the materials. There is a consistency to the anatomical construction of these things as well. And you notice when I talk about shape language, like nothing is more apparent than the shape language differences between these two characters, right? I mean, look at this. The joints on this all have this kind of like pointed, what do you call it? Just spiky, thorny kind of. It literally feels like a thorn bush. This guy feels like a thorn bush. And contrast that with this guy who has like a softer. It's not a thorn bush. It almost feels like aquatic, right? A little bit smoother, even though you still have these like cool, crazy spikes coming off of this guy. And there is some familiarity. Like obviously these guys might be related in the same universe or biologically similar, but they are not anatomically the same. Like they have, look at this like tiny waist, big chest piece. So similar like anatomical construction, but the shape language itself is echoed throughout the entire character. We see these like smooth, long, sharp blade things, and then that spiked thorn bush kind of like shape that we see on these like cutting blades. And that's when I talk about shape language, that's what I'm talking about. But also talk about like color theme, So these guys are a different faction or they perform a different function. I can't remember exactly how they work in game, but the differences like are consistent in each different faction, And so if nothing else, if these are just presenting two totally different ideas for the same thing that would perform the same function, well, then you're getting a real sense of variety from the two different ones. I actually don't aesthetically really care much for this like unicorn thorn head, but whatever. It is variety. When you're doing concept art, I think it's important to understand that consistency, that through line between, this is the function. Both of these guys perform the same function. Like that's what's interesting about these two designs, right? And that's why I'm like, well, maybe they were like pitches for the same dude, because functionally What's different? Long spindly legs, tiny little waist, one big bladed arm, and one sort of like power arm. So these are really interesting because they're basically paintovers of the old design for these creatures. This is from the remastered version. I thought this was really interesting also because this is another example of where, modern game development requires that you do like a front and a back, So like it's seeing the different stages and what we need to see for game development. Like what do we need to see in the scene of the game? And you have to have that kind of imagination to like understand, well, obviously, this is going to get the shell broken off of the back of it. And then it's got these like exposed meaty bits that are going to be vulnerable. Okay, so we probably need to see what it looks like when we rip that shell off. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of thinking you need to have when you're doing something like concept art for a game like this. And it makes it a little easier when it's a remaster or remake because you can play it and you can see what you need to design and then you can just go through and make a checklist. But if you don't have that sort of like rough build of the gameplay, then what you have to do is go in and try to make a checklist yourself. You're coming up with things, you're making it up on the fly, but you're anticipating what the designers might need to see, and then you're sort of waiting to see if something gets approved before you go and invest a ton of time into working on it, rendering it, and designing it. That's why a reason why I love remasters or I love working on remakes or sequels is because there's so much that's already decided. There's less of that blue sky, we don't know yet kind of response from designers. They know what they want when it's a remaster or a remake. They know where they're going. There's no question. Almost every game that I worked on that wasn't a remaster or a sequel, almost every game I've ever worked on, all the way up until the last year of development, everybody on the team is like, I don't even know what we're making. I know that might sound crazy to you, but game development really is like a conversation. And if it's a remaster or remake, it's sort of like a recap. Okay, so that's my look at the art of Metroid Prime Remaster. Not as much a roast as it is really just an analytical discussion. I also teach a lot of workshops. If you're interested in learning more about game development and what a concept artist does in a game development project, I've got these workshops and they have homework and it's really, really real-time breakdowns. It's not just time-lapsing of the artwork I do. But I have these workshops for environment concept art design, creature design, skin design. I've even got UI design over on my Gumroad channel. I want to encourage you to check that out if you're serious about working in video games. Your drawings, if you're an absolute beginner, I have the easy art lessons that just teach you to draw within 20 days. If you're like, I don't want to waste time learning all that boring stuff. Well, hey, I make the fundamentals really interesting. It's really actually a lot of fun. And you can read my testimonials about that. Saying goodbye is always the hardest part of making any video, but hopefully I'll see you in the next video. All right, thanks so much for stopping by, and I'll see you then. All right, ciao.